The smell of pine resin and cold stone was the first thing I noticed when they brought me inside the great hall of Asheville Keep. Not the torches lining the walls like burning sentinels. Not the massive iron chandelier hanging from the vaulted ceiling like a crown of frozen fire. Not even the rows of warriors standing so still they could have been carved from the same dark granite as the floor beneath my feet. No. It was the smell. Sharp, ancient, territorial. The kind of scent that settles into the back of your throat and tells your body, quietly and without negotiation, that you do not belong here. I belonged here less than anyone in that room knew. My name is Daisy Voss. I was 23 years old when I walked into Asheville Keep for the first time, and I walked in with my hands clasped in front of me, my blonde braid pinned neatly over one shoulder, wearing a gray wool cloak that had been mended at the hem twice, because I refused to buy a new one until I had cleared the last of my father's debts. I had been summoned, not invited, summoned, by the Alpha King himself, to serve as the new territorial record keeper, a position that sounded important until you understood what it actually meant. It meant I would organize the land scrolls no one else wanted to touch. It meant I would catalog the boundary disputes that other administrators had spent years deliberately losing between filing cabinets. It meant I would be useful, invisible, and entirely forgettable. That was the plan. The hall fell into a different kind of silence when I was walked to the center of it. I felt the shift the way you feel a drop in temperature before rain. Not dramatic, just certain. Eyes moved. Postures changed. Several of the warriors near the left wall turned their heads with the slow, measuring attention of people who had spent their entire lives deciding within seconds whether something was a threat or an irrelevance. I was clearly filed under the second category. A woman with close-cropped dark hair and a silver rank pin at her collar stepped forward to meet me. Her name was Sarah, I would later learn, the Keep's head of internal affairs, which meant she managed everything Orion considered beneath his direct attention. She looked me over the way someone looks at a piece of furniture they ordered online and are mildly disappointed by in person. Daisy Voss, she said. Not a question. A confirmation, the way you confirm a delivery. Yes, I said. Your predecessor left the record room in a condition that will require your full attention from the first morning. She turned and expected me to follow. The Alpha King does not tolerate delays in boundary documentation. Any dispute older than 4 weeks that remains unresolved costs the pack politically. You were recommended for your speed as much as your accuracy. Do not make us regret either. I followed her down a corridor that branched off the main hall, and I did not look back. I had learned early in life that looking back in rooms full of powerful people reads as either longing or fear, and I could not afford to display either. What I did not expect, what I had not prepared for at all, was that the Alpha King himself would be in that corridor. He was coming from the opposite direction with 2 of his senior wolves at his flanks, moving the way large. Dangerous things move when they are completely at ease in their own territory. Unhurried, but with a weight to every step that seemed to compress the air around him. He was taller than I had imagined, broader. His dark braids were pulled back from his face, and his eyes, even in the low amber light of the corridor torches, were the particular shade of blue that looks almost gray in shadow, sharp and still and evaluating everything at once. He stopped when he saw Sarah. Then his gaze moved to me. I felt it the way you feel unexpected cold water, a full-body awareness that arrived before thought could catch up with it. The new record keeper, Sarah said, with a small incline of her head toward me. He looked at me for 3 full seconds. I counted them, because counting kept my breathing even. Then something in his expression settled into a kind of dismissal that wasn't rude so much as absolute. The way a king looks at a new piece of furniture that has been placed in an appropriate and unremarkable corner. Voss, he said. Just my name. An acknowledgement that I existed, and that my existence had been noted and filed away. Alpha King, I said, and I inclined my head the appropriate degree. He moved to pass me. And then, I still don't fully understand what made me do it. I spoke again. The Callum-Dreth boundary dispute, I said. The one that's been sitting unresolved since the previous record keeper. I reviewed the preliminary files before I arrived. The original survey markers were placed on flood season soil. They shift every 3 years. That's why neither side's measurements match. It can be resolved in a week if someone authorizes a dry season resurvey. The silence that followed was a different kind from the one in the Great Hall. That one had been evaluating. This one was recalibrating. Orion had gone still. He turned back slowly, and this time when he looked at me, it was not the 3-second dismissal. It was longer, more specific. The way someone looks at something they thought they had already categorized and are now uncertain they placed correctly. "It's been unresolved for 14 months, Sarah said carefully, her tone carrying a note I couldn't fully interpret. "I know," I said. "I read the file twice on the journey here. The solution isn't complicated. What was missing was someone willing to say out loud that the original survey was flawed." I paused. "I'm willing to say it." Another beat of silence. Then Orion said very quietly, "Come to my study at the 8th hour tomorrow morning. Bring whatever you found." He walked away. His wolves followed. Sarah stood beside me for a moment, and I had the distinct impression she was revising something she had decided about me approximately 5 minutes ago. "That," she said at last, "was either very smart or very reckless. Can it be both?" I asked. She almost smiled. Almost. In this keep, those are often the same thing. She gestured forward. "Come, I'll show you the record room." The record room was, as advertised, a disaster. Scrolls piled on scrolls, wax seals broken and repressed in the wrong places, territorial maps that had been annotated by at least 4 different hands in 3 different colors of ink, with no legend explaining the system, filing cabinets left open, a window latched so long it had warped in the frame, and now let in a thin, continuous draft that made every loose page tremble slightly, as if the documents themselves were anxious. I stood in the doorway and breathed it all in. The dust, the old parchment smell, the faint metallic ghost of old ink. I felt, and I know how strange this sounds, completely calm. This was my language. Chaos that looked permanent until you found its internal logic. Disorder that was never actually random, only waiting for someone patient enough to listen to its pattern. I had grown up in a house full of unpaid debts and unanswered questions, and I had learned, very young, that the most overwhelming messes are just collections of small problems that nobody bothered to solve one at a time. Sarah left me with a candle and a key, and the advice to not stay past the 2nd bell of night, because the keep's heating cut to the east wing after that hour. I stayed until the 3rd bell. By the time I locked the record room behind me and felt my way down the dark corridor toward the small chamber I'd been assigned, I had already sorted the Calamdreth file completely, identified 2 other boundary disputes that shared the same structural flaw, and made a list of 7 questions I intended to ask Orion the following morning. I was almost back to my room when I heard voices around the corner. Low, male, carrying the easy contempt of people who don't bother to lower their volume because they don't believe anyone nearby matters. "Another one who thinks reading old maps makes her useful," one voice said. "Sarah must be desperate," said another. "She's an Omega. What's she going to do? Organize the Alpha King into submission?" Laughter. Low, brief, dismissive. I stood in the dark corridor and let the words settle on me the way cold air settles, evenly, completely, without room to argue with its presence. I had heard variations of this my entire life. Different rooms, different people. Same essential message. You are here on sufferance, and we have already decided your ceiling. I didn't move until the voices faded. Then I went to my room, sat on the edge of the bed that was slightly too short and smelled of cedar and someone else's tenure, and I looked at the dark window that faced east, away from the main courtyard, away from the lights of the Great Hall, out toward the open territory beyond the keep's walls. Somewhere out there, past the tree line, past the ridge I'd glimpsed from the carriage on the way in, I had noticed something on the map. An estate, unoccupied, technically outside Asheville Pack territory by a margin of 400 meters. I filed the thought away the way I filed everything, carefully, in a place I would be able to find it again. I would need it later. I just didn't know yet exactly how much. The 8th hour came with fog. It rolled in from the valley sometime before dawn and settled against the keep's stone walls like something that had decided to stay. I watched it from the narrow window of my room while I rebraided my hair, my fingers working through the familiar motion without needing my eyes. And I thought about what it meant to walk into a room where every advantage belonged to someone else. It meant you brought the only thing that was entirely yours. I picked up my folder of notes. Real notes. Not copies, not summaries, but the original observations I had made the night before. Written in the precise shorthand I had developed over years of working in cramped offices with bad lighting. And I walked to Orion's study. The door was already open when I arrived. He was standing at the large map table in the center of the room, his back to the door, studying something I couldn't see from the threshold. The study was nothing like I had expected from a king. No decorative swords mounted on the walls for display. No portraits. The bookshelves were full but not arranged for appearance. These were working books, spines cracked, several lying flat with other volumes stacked on top of them. Maps were layered across every flat surface. A compass sat open beside an inkwell. The whole room smelled of old paper, and something darker underneath, like wood smoke that had soaked into the walls over many years. It smelled like decisions had been made here. Real ones. "You're early," he said without turning. "The file is complicated enough that I didn't want to rush the explanation," I said. He turned then. In the morning light coming through the tall windows, his eyes were more gray than blue. The color of the fog outside, I thought, which seemed appropriate. He was not in full armor the way he had been in the corridor the night before. A simpler leather vest, bracers, dark shirt underneath. He looked, somehow, both more approachable and more dangerous in the same breath. He gestured at the table. I came forward, opened the folder, and laid out my notes beside the existing Callum-Dreth survey maps already spread on the table. And then I talked. Not nervously, not with the careful hedging I had learned to perform in rooms full of people who needed to feel smarter than me. I just talked, the way I talked when I was alone with a problem and working through it aloud. I showed him the original survey dates, matched them to the seasonal flood charts I had found misfiled under a completely different territory dispute, explained the soil shift pattern, walked him through why both the Callum side and the Dreth side were technically correct by their own measurements, and why that had made resolution impossible for 14 months. He listened. That was the first thing that surprised me about Orion. He listened the way very few powerful people listen, completely, without preparing his response while I was still speaking, without the subtle restlessness of someone waiting for you to finish so they could explain why they had already considered your point and found it insufficient. He stood with his arms folded across his chest and his gaze on the maps, and he listened to every word. When I finished, there was a silence that felt thoughtful rather than heavy. "The resurvey," he said. "You said 1 week. If the authorization goes out today and the surveyors leave tomorrow, yes. Who do you recommend for the survey team?" I paused. It wasn't a question I had expected. "I don't know your surveyors yet." "Make a recommendation anyway, based on what a fair survey would require." I thought for a moment. 2 people from neutral territory, no pack affiliation to either the Callum or Dreth line, and someone from my office as an observer, not to direct, just to document, so neither side can dispute the methodology afterward. He was quiet again. Then, "Done." He reached for a blank authorization slip from the corner of the table, signed it without ceremony, and pushed it toward me. "Take that to Sarah. She'll arrange the team." I picked it up. The ink was still slightly wet. I let it dry for a moment before folding it. "You said there were 2 others," he said. I looked up. "Last night you said the Callum-Dreth dispute wasn't the only one with this flaw." I hadn't said that to him. I had mentioned it to no one. The only record of that observation was in my own notes, which I had not shown to him. They were still in my folder, beneath the Calamdreth documents. He watched my expression process this and said, simply, "Sarah reported back." "Ah," I said. "She reports everything. It's why I keep her." A pause that was almost dry humor. "What are the other two?" I showed him. He listened again with the same quality of attention, and by the time I had finished walking through the third dispute, I had been in his study for nearly an hour, and the fog outside the windows had begun to thin. The territory beyond the walls was emerging in pieces. Gray-green hills, the dark line of forest, and further east, just visible on the ridge, the pale stone shape of a roofline. I looked at it for a fraction of a second too long. "The old Marath estate," Orion said. His voice had not changed in tone, but something in the room shifted slightly, the way a flame shifts when a door opens somewhere distant. "I noticed it on the map," I said carefully, "during the journey here. It's been empty for 6 years. He wasn't looking at the window, he was looking at me. The previous owner had no heirs. The territory sits outside pack land, technically freehold." "I know," I said. Another silence. This one had a texture to it I couldn't fully name. "You're a record keeper," he said. "Yes. Who reads property law?" "I read everything that might be relevant," I said. "I always have." He held my gaze for a moment that was 2 seconds longer than professionally necessary. Then he looked back at the maps. "You may go, Voss. Take the authorization to Sarah." I gathered my notes, folded them back into the folder, and walked to the door. "Voss." I stopped. "The work you did last night, the initial sort of the record room," he didn't turn around. "Sarah said you stayed past the heating cut." "The candle was still lit," I said. "Don't ruin your hands on the old wax seals. There's a solvent in the cabinet below the east window. The previous record keeper never found it." I stood in the doorway for one more second. Then, "Thank you." I left. The days that followed established a rhythm, and rhythm in a place like Asheville Keep was its own kind of language. I learned to read it the way I learned to read everything, by paying attention to the parts other people had decided weren't worth noticing. Breakfast in the Great Hall was stratified by rank so naturally that no one had to enforce it. The senior wolves took the long tables nearest the hearth. The mid-rank soldiers and staff filled the center rows. The administrative workers, healers, and lower-ranked members took the tables nearest the door, where the draft was worst and the food arrived last. I sat at the door tables without complaint, and ate what was left, and spent the meal listening to the conversations around me, learning names and relationships, and the invisible architecture of who owed what to whom. By the end of the first week, I knew more about the Keep's internal politics than most people who had lived there for years. Not because I was clever, or not only because of that, but because I was quiet in a way that made people forget I was there. People confess an enormous amount to empty space if the empty space is patient enough. His name was Cade, one of the senior warriors who had laughed in the corridor my first night. He was broad-shouldered and casually confident in the way of someone who had never genuinely been challenged, and he made a point of being visible every time I crossed the main hall, in the manner of someone who had decided my presence was a minor inconvenience worth tracking. He never said anything directly hostile. He didn't need to. The looks were sufficient. His counterpart in that pair of voices from the corridor. I identified him later in the week as a wolf named Bren, lower ranked than Cade, but with the particular social agility of someone who stayed useful by making the right people laugh. Bren was the kind of person who never said the cruelest thing out loud himself, but who laughed at exactly the right moment to let everyone know he agreed with whoever did. I filed them both away. Sarah, I was recalibrating daily. She was harder than she appeared, and kinder than she permitted people to notice. On the third day, she brought a second candle to the record room without explanation, and left it on the cabinet without comment. On the fifth day, she answered a question I hadn't asked yet, which told me she had been watching how I worked closely enough to predict what I would need next. By the end of the week, I had decided she was one of the most competent people in the Keep, and that she knew it, and had long ago made peace with the fact that her competence would always be described as somebody else's efficiency. I liked her for that. The Calamdreth resurvey came back at the end of the week exactly as I had predicted. The new markers were placed. Both sides signed the resolution document without dispute. When Orion received the completed file, I delivered it to his study myself, as was protocol. He looked it over in silence, then set it aside. "The other 2 disputes," he said. "Same approach?" "Similar. The third one has an added complication. There's a water rights clause buried in the original deed that nobody's referenced in 40 years because the stream it covers dried up. But last spring's rainfall shifted it back. It's running again. That changes the value of the land significantly." He looked at me across the map table. "How long have you known about the stream?" "Since my second day," I said. "I wanted to verify the rainfall records before I mentioned it." Something moved behind his eyes. Not warmth exactly. Something more like recognition. The way you look at a tool you've been using incorrectly and suddenly understand its actual purpose. "Bring me the water rights analysis when it's ready," he said. I nodded and turned to go. "Voss." His voice again from behind me. Lower this time. Not commanding, just present. I paused. "The estate on the ridge," he said. "I'd advise against it." The room was very quiet. Outside, the wind had picked up, pressing against the tall windows. I turned back slowly. "I haven't done anything about the estate, Alpha King." "Not yet," he said. I held his gaze for exactly as long as was appropriate. Then I inclined my head, precisely, correctly, not 1 millimeter deeper than protocol required, and walked out. Behind me, I could have sworn I heard the quietest exhale, almost like the beginning of a laugh that decided at the last moment not to arrive. I bought the estate on a Thursday, not impulsively. I want to be clear about that. The decision had been building for 3 weeks, accreting quietly the way decisions do when you've already made them in your heart, but are waiting for your logic to catch up and sign the documents. I had spent those 3 weeks verifying every detail: the freehold status, the boundary survey, the title history, the structural assessments filed with the regional land office, the outstanding tax arrears that had accumulated over 6 years of vacancy, and that, once cleared, would make the deed transfer perfectly clean and entirely uncontestable. I cleared the arrears on a Wednesday. I signed the transfer papers on Thursday morning. The estate agent, a small, precise man from the valley town of Carré, who smelled of pipe tobacco and old ledgers, handed me the deed with the slightly stunned expression of someone who had expected this transaction to take considerably longer. "You've reviewed everything?" he asked. For the second time. 3 times, I said. The structural report, the water table assessment, the boundary survey, and the historical title chain back to the original land grant. I folded the deed carefully and placed it in the inner pocket of my cloak, close to my chest. "Everything is in order." He looked at me for a moment longer. Then he stamped the transfer record, initialed the copy, and slid it across the desk with the expression of a man who had decided to simply admire what he didn't fully understand. "The property will need work," he offered. "I know," I said. "That's part of the appeal. I told no one at the keep. I didn't need to. By the following morning, everyone knew. I have never fully understood how information moves through a pack, but it moves the way weather moves, without asking permission, without clear origin, arriving everywhere at once. I walked into the great hall for breakfast and felt the shift in the room before I had taken 3 steps. Heads turning, conversations adjusting. That specific quality of silence that forms around a person when they have done something that requires people to reassess the category they placed them in. I sat at my usual table by the door. The draft was the same as always. The food arrived in the same order. I ate and listened and let the recalibration happen around me without performing any reaction to it. Cade was staring at me from the hearth table. Not the lazy, dismissive tracking he had been doing for 3 weeks. This was different. Sharper. The stare of someone who had told himself a story about a person and is now sitting with the discomfort of evidence that the story was wrong. Bren, beside him, leaned over, and said something that made Cade's jaw tighten. I looked away, before either of them could decide what my expression meant. Sarah found me in the record room an hour later. She came in without knocking, which was unusual. Sarah always knocked, and she stood in the doorway for a moment, with an expression I had never seen on her face before. Not quite alarm, not quite amusement. Something balanced precisely between them. "The Marath estate," she said. "Good morning, Sarah." "You bought it." "I did." She came inside and closed the door behind her. That was when I understood this was not going to be a brief conversation. Sarah only closed doors when she needed to say something she didn't want to have to repeat in front of witnesses. "He's going to want to speak with you," she said. I assumed. I kept my eyes on the file I was working through, partly because the work genuinely needed attention, and partly because maintaining my normal rhythm felt important. "Has he sent for me?" "Not yet. He was in the Eastern training ground when Cade brought him the news." A pause. "He finished his training session before he said anything, which either means he's not concerned or he's more concerned than he wanted Cade to see." I looked up at that. Sarah had a gift for reading Orion's silences that I suspected came from years of practice. "Which do you think it is?" She tilted her head. "Concerned," she said, "but not in the way Cade thinks." I held her gaze for a moment. "What does Cade think?" "That you've made a territorial provocation. That an Omega acquiring land on the border of Pact territory is, his word, presumptuous." Her voice remained completely neutral. The way Sarah's voice always remained neutral when she was conveying something that personally offended her. "He's been suggesting to anyone who will listen that the Alpha King should have the transfer reviewed." "The transfer is legally clean," I said. "I checked it 3 times. I know. I checked it myself this morning." She said this without any self-consciousness, which I appreciated. "It's entirely legitimate. The land is freehold. Your right to purchase it is unambiguous." Another pause. "That's not the point Cade is making." "No," I agreed. "It isn't. The point Cade was making had nothing to do with legality. It had to do with the story he needed to believe. That people like me existed within a certain perimeter, moved within a certain range, and did not reach beyond it. That story was comfortable for Cade. It organized the world in a way that kept him near the center of it. My deed transfer didn't break any law. It just broke his narrative, which was, in its own way, more threatening to him than any legal challenge. I had understood this from the night I first heard him in the corridor. I had simply waited to be certain I was right before doing anything about it. "Daisy." Sarah used my first name so rarely that the sound of it landed differently than other words. I looked up again. Her expression had lost its careful neutrality for a moment. Just a moment. And what was underneath it was something close to concern. "Be careful today. Not of the Alpha King." She paused. "Of Cade." "Why Cade specifically?" "Because Orion frustrates him," she said quietly. "Orion hasn't reacted the way Cade expected him to, and frustrated men with rank and an audience are more unpredictable than angry ones." I thought about that after she left. I thought about it while I finished the file I was working on, and while I walked the corridor to deliver 3 completed resolution documents to the administrative hall, and while I came back through the main courtyard, where the morning training had given way to the quieter mid-morning movement of wolves going about the business of the day. I was crossing the courtyard when Cade stepped into my path. He didn't do it violently. That was the particular skill of people like Cade. They created confrontation without technically initiating it, placing themselves in the geometry of your movement so that the encounter appeared accidental, while being entirely deliberate. "Voss," he said. I stopped. Cade. He was taller than me by nearly a foot, and built in the way of someone whose size had always been the first thing people responded to. He looked down at me with an expression that was almost friendly, in the way that a closed door is almost open. "Interesting news this morning," he said. "Lots of interesting things happen every morning," I said pleasantly. "This keep is a busy place." The Marath estate. His tone didn't change. That was deliberate, too. That's quite a reach for a record keeper. It's quite a reasonable property price for a freehold of that size, I said. The arrears had driven the market value down significantly. It was a sensible acquisition. Sensible. He repeated the word the way people repeat words they're deciding whether to treat as an insult. That's one way to describe it. What's another way? I asked. My voice was completely calm. I had learned, a long time ago, that calm was the only unassailable position in a conversation designed to destabilize you. Anger gives the other person something to point at. Calm just reflects their pressure back at them until they have to feel it themselves. He looked at me for a long moment. Something shifted behind his eyes. Not retreat, exactly, but a recalculation. He had expected a different response. Nervousness, probably. Defensiveness. Something he could work with. Know your place, Voss, he said. Quietly. Pleasantly. Like advice between colleagues. The courtyard wasn't empty. There were perhaps 12 people within earshot. Warriors, staff, 2 of the mid-rank wolves from the Eastern Patrol. All of them had gone carefully, professionally still in the way of people who are paying very close attention while pretending not to. I looked at Cade for exactly 3 seconds. Then I executed a perfect formal curtsy. The kind reserved for addressing someone of recognized superior rank. Precise and unambiguous and absolutely correct in its form. And I turned and walked away. I didn't hurry. I didn't look back. I walked at my normal pace across the remainder of the courtyard and through the corridor door and down to the record room, and I sat down at my desk and I placed my hands flat on the surface and I breathed for exactly 30 seconds. Then I opened the next file. What I didn't know, what I only learned later, from Sarah, who had been at the far end of the courtyard near the storage entrance, was that Orion had been standing in the upper corridor window that overlooks the main courtyard. He had watched the entire exchange. Sarah said he didn't move during it, didn't react. Stood at the window with one hand resting on the frame, and watched Cade step into my path, watched the conversation I couldn't fully hear from her position, and watched me curtsy and walk away. She said that after I went inside, he stood at the window for another long moment. Then he walked away from it in the direction of his study. She said the look on his face was not the expression of a man watching an Omega know her place. She said it was the expression of a man watching something he didn't entirely know how to name. I thought about that for a long time. Sitting in my record room with old maps spread before me, and the smell of dust and ink around me like a second skin. I thought about Orion at the window. I thought about what Sarah's face had looked like when she told me. Careful, but with that small, precise light in her eyes that I had learned to recognize as her version of satisfaction. Outside, the fog had cleared entirely. The morning had gone bright and cold, and through the record room's narrow window I could see, if I angled my head just right, the pale stone roof line of the Marath estate on the ridge. My estate. I looked at it for a moment. Just a moment. Then I went back to work. He came to the estate on a Saturday. I know because I was on the roof. Not the full roof. There was a section of the eastern parapet that the structural report had flagged as stable but neglected, and I had spent the better part of the morning up there with a borrowed toolkit and a very clear mental image of what the space could become once the crumbling mortar between the stones was repointed and the drainage channel along the inner edge was cleared of 6 years of accumulated debris. I had tied my braid back, rolled my sleeves to the elbow, and was working through a particularly stubborn section of blocked stone channel when I heard horses below. I looked down over the parapet edge. Orion was dismounting in the courtyard that wasn't yet a courtyard. It was an overgrown rectangle of old cobblestones disappearing under 2 seasons of weeds, with a collapsed section of outer wall on the south side that I had already contracted a mason from Carey to address. He was alone, which surprised me. In the 3 weeks I had been at Asheville Keep, I had never seen the Alpha King move through open territory without at least 2 wolves at his back. He looked up. I was, objectively, not at my most authoritative, covered in stone dust, sleeves rolled, trowel in one hand, a smear of mortar that I could feel drying on my left cheekbone. I looked down at him from the parapet, and he looked up at me from the weeds, and the moment had a quality I couldn't quite categorize. "The parapet is stable," I said by way of greeting. I checked the survey. "I know," he said. "I read your structural report." Of course he had. I climbed down from the parapet by way of the interior staircase, a narrow stone spiral thing that smelled of old wood and something faintly herbal, as if someone had once grown plants in the upper rooms and the ghost of them still lived in the walls. By the time I came out through the ground floor entrance, Orion had tied his horse to the old iron post near the entrance and was standing in what would eventually be the main receiving hall, looking up at the high ceiling with the particular expression of someone taking inventory. The hall was bare stone, swept clean. I had done that myself in the first 2 days, with afternoon light coming through windows that were intact but filmed with years of dust, casting everything in a diffused gray-gold glow. The proportions of the room were genuinely beautiful. High-arched ceiling, deep window alcoves, a fireplace large enough to stand in. It had the bones of something excellent that had simply been left alone too long. "It's bigger than it looks from the road," Orion said. "Most worthwhile things are," I said. He turned at my voice, took in the stone dust and the rolled sleeves and the trowel I was still holding without comment. His gaze moved briefly to the mortar on my cheek, then returned to my eyes without expression. "You're doing the restoration work yourself," he said. It wasn't disapproval. It was a genuine observation. The way he made all his observations. Direct, without editorializing. Some of it. The structural work I've contracted out. The mason arrives Monday. But the parapet drainage and the interior cleaning I'm doing on my own time. I paused. "It's faster." "That's not why," he said. I looked at him. "You do it yourself because you trust your own assessment more than anyone else's," he said, "and because the work helps you think." The hall was very quiet. Outside, a wind moved through the overgrown courtyard, shifting the dry weeds against the old stones. "Why are you here?" I asked. Not rudely, just directly because the question was the honest one, and I had learned that Orion operated better in direct honesty than in the careful circling that most people defaulted to around him. He was quiet for a moment. He walked to the nearest window alcove and stood in it, looking out at the slope of the territory, the ridge falling away to the valley, the tree line, and beyond it, the dark silhouette of Asheville Keep against the gray sky. "Cade requested a formal review of your land transfer," he said. I had expected this. "The transfer is clean." "I know. I reviewed it myself before he submitted the request." A pause. "I denied it. I absorbed that. He won't accept the denial easily." "No," Orion agreed. "He won't." He was still looking out the window. His profile in the gray light was very still, and I had the sense, not for the first time, that this was a man who had spent a great deal of his life making decisions in rooms where he was the only one willing to say the true thing out loud. Cade has rank and history in this pack. He has also spent years operating under the assumption that his rank excuses him from accountability. He paused. "It doesn't. But assumptions that old are not corrected quickly." "I'm not asking you to correct it," I said. He turned then. "I know you're not." Something shifted in his expression, not softening exactly, but an opening, the way a window opens when the latch is turned. "That's part of what I came to say." I waited. "The courtyard confrontation," he said. "I saw it. Sarah told me. What Sarah may not have told you," he continued, with the careful precision of someone choosing each word for a specific purpose, "is what I said to Cade afterward." I went still. I called him to my study that afternoon. I told him that his conduct in the courtyard was an abuse of rank directed at a member of this keep's administrative staff. I told him that if I witnessed, or received a credible report of, a second incident, the consequence would be formal, and it would be public. He paused. He did not take it well. The room felt different than it had a moment ago. Not heavier, lighter, in the specific way that a space feels lighter when something that has been quietly pressing on it is removed. "You didn't have to do that," I said. "I know," he said simply. "I did it because it was correct." He looked at me steadily. "Not as a favor to you, Voss. As a function of what this pack is supposed to be." I understood the distinction he was drawing and why he was drawing it. He was not performing generosity. He was describing a standard. The difference mattered enormously. "The water rights analysis is finished," I said after a moment. "For the third boundary dispute. I was going to bring it to you Monday." "Bring it tomorrow," he said. "It's Sunday. I work Sundays." The ghost of that almost laugh again, in the slight shift at the corner of his mouth. "Bring it in the afternoon. The morning is training." He moved toward the entrance, and I walked with him through the hall and out into the overgrown courtyard. His horse was waiting patiently, reins loose against the iron post. He untied the horse and then paused before mounting, looking at the estate, the full face of it, pale stone and arched windows, and the east parapet where I had been working, with the gap in the outer wall to the south, where the mason would come Monday. "How long for the restoration?" he asked. "Full restoration?" 2 years, if I pace it against my salary." I paused. "A year, if the boundary dispute resolutions generate the commission fee my contract specifies." He looked at me. "You negotiated a commission clause." "I negotiated several clauses," I said pleasantly. "The commission, the equipment provision, and the right of first review on any land documentation that originates in the Eastern Territories." The look on his face in that moment was... I searched for the right word later, turning it over in the record room by candlelight. It was something close to delight. Not the broad, performed delight of someone who laughs easily. The quieter, rarer kind. The delight of a person who encounters something that genuinely exceeds their expectations and doesn't quite know what to do with the surplus of it. He mounted without another word and turned his horse toward the ridge path. Then he stopped. "Voss." "Yes?" He looked back over his shoulder. The gray sky had shifted while we were inside, the cloud cover breaking in the west to let through a single band of late light that fell across the ridge and lit the pale stone of the estate wall, and caught the dust still visible on my rolled sleeve. "The estate suits you," he said. Then he rode down the ridge toward the keep, and I stood in the weeds of my not-yet courtyard and watched him go, and I felt something shift in my chest that I had no immediate intention of examining too closely. The Sunday meeting was not brief. I brought the water rights analysis, and he read every page of it, which took 20 minutes, during which I sat across the map table and worked through my own notes for the following week's disputes. We occupied the same room in the same silence that had become, without either of us formally acknowledging it, a specific and established kind of shared space. Not comfortable exactly. There was always a current to it, a low and continuous awareness of the other person's presence. But functional. Genuine. Sarah had started leaving 2 cups on the tray she sent to the study on Sunday afternoons. She hadn't mentioned it. Neither had I. It was Bren who pushed things sideways, in the way that secondary actors always push things sideways. Not through direct confrontation, but through the more corrosive method of sustained whisper. By the end of the 3rd week after the courtyard incident, the story circulating through the lower corridors of the keep had evolved from the record keeper bought the border estate into something considerably more pointed. That she was positioning herself. That she was leveraging access to the Alpha King. That the Sunday meetings had nothing to do with water rights. I heard the evolved version of the story on a Tuesday evening from a young administrative assistant named Pip. 22 years old, nervous energy, genuinely good instincts, who came to find me in the record room with the specific expression of someone delivering news they wish they didn't have. "I thought you should know," Pip said after telling me. "What they're saying." "Thank you," I said. "I mean that." "What are you going to do?" I looked at the file open in front of me. The Eastern Boundary Consolidation Project, 12 separate disputes that once resolved, would redraw 4 territorial lines and settle arguments that had been generating paperwork for a generation. It was the biggest project I had taken on since arriving, and it required the Alpha King's formal endorsement to proceed. I had been waiting for the right moment to present it. "I'm going to do my job," I said. Pip looked at me with the expression of someone who had expected a more dramatic answer. "That is the dramatic answer," I said. "Just give it a moment." The Eastern Consolidation presentation took place on a Wednesday in the Great Hall, with the full senior council present. 12 wolves of rank, Sarah at the end of the table, and Cade 3 seats from the Alpha King's right hand, with an expression so carefully neutral it had clearly taken effort to construct. I stood at the head of the map table, and I presented every detail. The history of the disputes, the resolution methodology, the projected territorial clarity, the economic benefit to the Pact's border security. I spoke for 40 minutes without notes, because I knew every word of it. Because I had built every word of it from scratch over 5 weeks of pre-dawn mornings and late candlelit nights. And because the work was real, and it was correct, and the only thing left was to say it clearly in a room that had already decided how to feel about me. When I finished, the hall was quiet. Then Cade spoke. "It's an ambitious proposal," he said, with the particular tone of someone using the word ambitious as a synonym for something less complimentary. For someone who's been here less than 2 months. The room waited. I looked at Cade across the length of the map table, and I thought about the corridor on my first night, and the courtyard, and the story that had been moving through the lower halls. And then I looked at the map spread between us. All those tangled borders, all those decades of unresolved argument, and I thought about what it meant to do work that was true, regardless of whether the room wanted to receive it. "It is ambitious," I said. "The territory has been waiting for it for 40 years. I don't think it should wait any longer." The silence stretched. Then Orion said from the head of the table without looking up from the map, "Approved." One word, absolute, final. Cade's jaw tightened. I kept my eyes on the map and did not allow my expression to change by a single degree. But somewhere underneath the professional stillness, something warm and certain moved through me, quiet as a current, strong as a tide, and I recognized it for what it was, the beginning of belonging. The Eastern Consolidation took 4 months to complete. I want to say that slowly, because those 4 months contained more living than the 2 years before them combined. 4 months of pre-dawn mornings in the record room, of survey teams dispatched and returned, of boundary markers reset and deed transfers signed, and 40 years of accumulated argument dissolved one document at a time into something clean and clear and permanent. 4 months of Sunday afternoons in Orion's study with 2 cups on the tray and maps between us, and a silence that had evolved, quietly and without ceremony, into something neither of us had formally named, but both of us understood. 4 months of Cade watching from a distance with diminishing certainty, and Bren growing quieter as the Whisper campaign found less and less purchase in a keep, where the actual work was increasingly visible and increasingly impossible to dismiss. 4 months of Pip growing from a nervous assistant into someone who arrived at the record room early and stayed late and asked the precise, well-structured questions of a person learning to think rather than simply to execute. 4 months of Sarah leaving the second cup without comment, and occasionally, very occasionally, staying after she delivered the tray to sit at the corner of the map table and offer an observation that landed with the quiet accuracy of someone who had been watching this pack from the inside for 20 years and understood its rhythms better than anyone alive. And 4 months of the estate on the ridge becoming, stone by stone and room by room, a home. The mason finished the outer wall in the 6th week. The parapet drainage was clear and repointed by the 8th. The interior rooms came together more slowly. I did most of that work myself, on evenings and Saturday mornings, learning the particular character of each space the way you learn a person, through repeated proximity and patient attention. The receiving hall cleaned up into something genuinely beautiful, the high ceiling catching morning light through the D-filmed windows in a way that filled the room with something close to gold. The upper study, a smaller room with east-facing windows and built-in shelves along two walls, became mine in the specific way that spaces become yours when you have spent enough solitary hours in them that the room begins to feel like an extension of your thinking. I moved my personal belongings from the keep in the 10th week. Just the practical things at first. Clothes, books, the leather satchel I carried my work files in. But the act of moving them was itself a statement, and I knew it. And I made it anyway because the alternative was to remain in a room that had always been temporary and pretend it was sufficient. Sarah helped me carry the last box. She didn't offer to help. She simply appeared at my chamber door on a Saturday morning with her sleeves already rolled and the expression of someone who had already decided and was not inviting discussion. We walked the ridge path together in the early morning light, and she didn't say much, which was one of the many things I had come to value about her. When we set the last box down in the upper study, she stood at the east window and looked out at the view. The ridge falling away, the valley, the distant line of the keep against the sky. And she was quiet for a long moment. "This is the best view in the territory," she said finally. "I know," I said. "I noticed it on the map." She turned and looked at me with that small, precise light in her eyes. "You noticed it on the map before you ever arrived." "Yes." She shook her head, but the shake carried something fond in it. Then she went home, and I stood alone in my study with the morning coming through the east windows and the whole of the territory spread before me, and I felt something settle in my chest that had not been settled since long before I could clearly remember. Cade's formal censure came at the end of the 3rd month. It was not dramatic. Drama, I had learned, was mostly what happened when process was avoided for too long. Orion had been methodical about it, building a documented record of incidents, collecting accounts from witnesses, allowing Cade every opportunity to correct course before the formal proceeding. Cade had not corrected course. He had in fact continued, more carefully, more quietly, with greater deniability, to undermine both my work and, more critically, the Alpha King's decisions that endorsed it. The censure stripped 2 ranks and 3 territorial privileges. Cade accepted it with the specific tight-jawed silence of a man who has always believed the rules existed for other people and is encountering, at significant personal cost, the evidence that they do not. Bren, without Cade's rank and confidence to orbit around, became simply a man at a table who was quieter than he used to be. That was enough. Pip was formally assigned to the record office 2 weeks after the censure, a move that Sarah executed through the administrative channels with an efficiency that suggested she had been waiting for the right moment for some time. Pip arrived on the first morning with the expression of someone who had been handed something they had wanted badly enough to be slightly afraid of wanting. "Don't be nervous," I told them. "The work is just problems waiting for someone patient enough to solve them." Pip nodded with the visible determination of someone taking that instruction seriously. They became, over the months that followed, genuinely excellent. The Eastern consolidation closed on a Thursday afternoon in early spring. The final document, a single consolidated territorial charter replacing the 12 separate dispute records, signed by all relevant parties, stamped, sealed, and entered into the permanent record, was the cleanest piece of documentation I had ever produced. I looked at it for a long moment before I filed it. Not with pride exactly. With something quieter. The satisfaction of a thing made correctly. That would last. I brought the completion record to Orion's study that evening. He was at the map table when I arrived, as he almost always was at that hour. The work of running a territory being the kind of work that doesn't observe closing time. He looked up when I came in, and I set the completion record on the table in front of him and sat down across from it. He read it in full. He always read things in full. It was one of the many things I respected about him. When he set it down, he was quiet for a moment. "It's done," he said. "It's done," I agreed. The evening light was coming through the study windows at the low angle of early spring, filling the room with the particular amber warmth of a season just arriving. The maps were spread between us as always. The 2 cups were on the tray as always. and the silence between us was what it had become over 4 months of Sundays. Not empty, not weighted, but inhabited. The kind of silence that exists between people who have learned each other's rhythms and no longer need to fill every space with words. Orion looked at me across the map table. "When I first saw you in this corridor," he said, "I filed you under unremarkable." "I know," I said. "I was wrong within approximately 36 hours. 24, I said. The corridor conversation was the evening of my first day. Something moved in his expression, that rare, genuine quality of it. 24, he conceded. I looked at the completion record between us. Then I looked at him. When Cade told me to know my place, I said, I thought about it seriously. I spent 3 seconds thinking about it very carefully. I paused. And then I decided that I did know my place. I had simply not finished building it yet. Orion held my gaze for a long, still moment. Then he reached across the map table. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the deliberate certainty of someone who has made a decision and is done waiting to enact it. And he placed his hand over mine, where it rested on the edge of the table. His hand was warm and certain, and the weight of it was nothing like a constraint. It was the opposite of a constraint. It was the feeling of being accurately located, of being seen and found and placed, finally, by someone who had looked directly at what you were and not looked away. Your place, he said quietly, is wherever you decide it is. I turned my hand under his and held it. Outside the study windows, the spring evening had deepened into the first true dark of the season, and across the ridge the windows of the Marath estate, my estate, were lit against the night. The warm light of a home that had been waiting 6 years for someone to come back and make it one. In the years that followed, people told the story in different ways. Some told it as a story about an Omega who outmaneuvered an Alpha King. That version missed the point entirely. Orion was never outmaneuvered. He was met, which is a different thing, and rarer. Some told it as a story about Cade's downfall, which was too small a frame. Cade was an obstacle, not the story. The story was never about him. Sarah told it, on the rare occasions she told it at all, as a story about paperwork. I appreciated her version the most. The Eastern Consolidation Charter held for decades without challenge. It became the model for territorial documentation across 4 neighboring pacts. A fact that Pip, who eventually led the record office with a precision and care that made me quietly proud every time I heard of it, never failed to mention when training new staff. The estate on the ridge was fully restored within 14 months. The receiving hall became, in time, a place where territorial mediations were held. Neutral ground, technically outside pact jurisdiction, presided over by someone both sides trusted to be precise and fair. I had not planned that. But it was, I came to understand, what the space had always been suited for. Orion and I did not have a grand ceremony. We had a Thursday evening in the study, and a completion record, and a hand held across a map table. And everything that came after was built on that. On the accumulated weight of 4 months of work and honesty, and 2 cups on a tray, and a silence between us that had grown, gradually and irreversibly, into something as solid and permanent as the stone walls of the Ridge estate. On the morning after that Thursday evening, I walked up the ridge path to the estate in the early spring light. The valley was still misted below. The keep was visible in the distance, its dark towers catching the first sun, and the estate, my estate, with its cleared parapet and repointed stones and east-facing study windows, stood in the morning exactly as I had imagined it, months ago, from the back of a carriage on an unfamiliar road, looking at a map and seeing not what was there, but what could be. I stood in the courtyard, a real courtyard now, cobblestones clear, the south wall whole and solid, and I looked out at the territory. I had known my place. I had simply built it to specifications.